my friends, I'm Rick, and this is your Seat at the Table. And hey, we are still looking at our deep dive into, well, our shallow dive and belly crawl, I guess, into the first edition books of Dungeons and Dragons. And we've seen the Monster Manual, the Player Handbook, and the Dungeon Master Guide. And by all intents and purposes, if you have those three books, you don't need another one. Don't ever buy another damn book. Use your imagination because they're there. There's one of those topics that comes up repeatedly these days on various social platforms, I have noticed, and one of them is this debate between rules light and rules heavy, or chunky rules. And there's a lot of proponents to simpler systems and easier to understand and easier to run game mechanics and things like that. And then there are others who propose that the sheer wide range of options available with a heavier system with deeper rule sets gives you a lot more flexibility and actually freedom to think outside the box. So, for example, and just as a kind of an offbeat side note on this sort of stuff, if we look at the current D&D concept for their virtual tabletop that Wizards of the Coast is pushing real hard, and may have screwed themselves pretty hard for the next few years too, because of their poorly handled antics for the open gaming license stuff, is that I don't care how sophisticated your supposed virtual AI is and how sophisticated your game mechanics options are for your video game like system, there's still some gross limitations. This is one of the reasons why I've always said that video games themselves, for the most part, are brain dead games. What I mean by that is yeah, it takes a lot of skill and savvy and intellect and troubleshooting and problem solving to accomplish all the goals and to reach the end or the conclusion of the quote game in question. And then, of course, the open sandbox version of those games is just basically a never-ending option and variety of the same thing. It's what they lack is the inability for your players and your GM to come up with creative solutions or creative challenges that don't fit the square box or the round peg hole that the mechanics of the game system is allowing you to do. So for that purpose, for that mindset, I don't know that you can ever create a truly video game style version of a role-playing game system that is truly going to match and compete with the old pen and paper version, and in part because the imagination is a vast machine, and with endless possibilities and options that are only limited by our views and our willingness to think outside the box. Well, how do you apply things like that? And this is where, in the early days, we started to see the evolution of what you might call Splat Books or Crunch today. Why do we need, the basic rule set for Dungeons and Dragons? I pull it out and I want to know about something. It's got a very clear cut, very straightforward way to help you mediate it or how to get a result for it. Then later, people want to go more in depth. Some players want to have an even richer experience. They want to buy in even more, and they want to know a little more about how to do something, or what's the parameters that we can work with to accomplish climbing, for example. And this is what led to having in-depth, more rule sets, more targeted sets for those kinds of rules. So when we started seeing books like this come out, it was a natural evolution, because we've seen a lot of this material come out in Dragon and Dungeon magazines and other magazines during the time, and that was the magazines were the vehicle, the tool that allowed the game companies to explore lots of things without committing to a huge amount of resources to produce a product that may or may not be acceptable by the general base of the people who are going to buy them. And so those game magazines were test beds and trial beds for a lot of stuff. They were also testing grounds for writers and artists and creators, and so they served a valuable tool and a valuable resource. One of those things that in some aspects we don't see as much of today. We just don't see a virtual online magazine devoted towards BattleTech or devoted towards Dungeons and Dragons like the old system magazines were. And I'm not saying that they don't exist. I personally haven't seen them, so I'm sure that you'll point out one or two that I don't know about. But there's still there's some disconnect that's happened in modern ages, even though we have access to the internet. So I bought this book and I paid $15 for it. And what year was this thing? In '86. So the year after I got out, I would have been 19 when I bought this book. And this book actually has two sections. There's a section for the players, and then there's a section for the game masters. So the book is 2 books in one. And one of the things, if you look at obviously the title, the Dungeoneer Survival Guide. So we're expanding on underground operations and rule sets and settings and idea factories, because not everybody is a Rembrandt, not everybody is a Steve Jobs. I mean, not everybody has a massively overactive vivid imagination. Sometimes you need guidance, you need some control blocks, you need signposts to help you find your way and to decide what works for you and what works for your players. Another thing that has not so much changed or evolved over the decades, in my personal opinion, as I'm observing this sort of stuff, is that in the early days when I was a kid, if you were an avid player, you wanted to know as much about the books and the rules as the next guy. And as a player, you were actually expected to have your player's handbook for the game, or your copy of the rules for your players for your game, and to become familiar with them. You were actually encouraged to become a component, a collaboration effort with the person who's quote the game master or the dungeon master or the judge or whatever the hell you want to call yourself. What doesn't matter. But the kind of the point is you guys worked as a team, and so it wasn't necessary for the dungeon master to memorize every frickin' line, every quote, every paragraph, and quote them on demand, because that was unrealistic at best and absurd at worst. And so I've seen over the years a larger number of players come to the table who really their only focus ends and begins with their character, and to a lot of aspects they don't go any further than that. So unless it's pertaining to something their character wants to do, they don't care, and which is fine. But it's also detrimental to a deeper enjoyment by everybody, because sometimes it's easier if the player can say, I want to do this and here's how I think it should be done, and the game master having the confidence that the player has read the same material that he has or she has and has an understanding how that stuff would work. And so when we look at things like, yes, it's the table of contents, if you get lost by the table of contents or put off by it, I don't tell you, it's part of the damn book, my friend. It's what's there. If you think I'm going through this section by section, line by line, you're a loon. No offense, man. You don't want a 15-hour freaking video or a series of videos on me doing small element pieces. That's just nuts. So, Dungeoneer's Survival Guide explains what it is. Gives you an overview of the Underdark if you've never been there, and some excellent visuals for people who really haven't. I've had, one experience when I was younger. My current wife and I got married, and we went down and went through the caverns at Mark Twain State Park in Missouri, and we had the privilege of being down there at the same time. There was frickin' 4 busloads of elementary school kids on the tour. So we were all down there, and the guide shuts the light off because she wanted you to understand just how dark is. You really don't understand just how dark is until you're 100 feet below ground and the pitch black. You literally cannot see nothing. you just, there's nothing to see, and your other senses start to become more aware. Although mine was smothered by about 70 screaming kids, but you know, it really, if you've never been in that situation, it's kind of hard to put your imagination to use. And sometimes it's not necessarily a disadvantage, because your imagination will envision things that may not be much more dramatic and than anything that would actually be in the truth. So I looked at this book when I first came out, and I thought this was an excellent amendment for some rule sets to expand on things. So if we're looking at example, holding one's breath, swimming, holding one's breath in non-swimming situations, moving in water, endurance, with dealing with endurance and water. So we got effects of moving water, and then we got a whole section on climbing, rates of climb, climbing success for non-thieves, dealing with smooth various types of surfaces, running from smooth but cracked to a pole to a sloping wall. I mean, it's not that this is where this evolution of crunchy rules starts to come from, because now we say, okay, well, it's not just enough to see if we can roll a dice and see if our dexterity or our agility or our climbing skill helps us succeed to climb that frickin' pole, but maybe we want a little bit more information on it, and then that leads us to books like this, which has lots more information and gives you a lot more options. So we things like climbing tools, rappelling, how to use ropes, crossing with grapples, without grapples, swinging across, belaying, roping. If you don't know nothing about spelunking or rope work at all and climbing, then what would you know about what belaying means? Maybe this is how you find out in the day. Keep in mind, when these books first started coming out, this video, this thing that we are using right now did not exist. For the majority of people, did not have access to Google, because Google didn't exist. Nowadays, we have much grander and easier time of understanding stuff. So if we're looking at something, how would you really swing across a gorge, a crack in the floor, and you could video and actually see people doing it. So I mean, you had to come up with a verbal, written visual for us to understand how that might work. So impromptu bridges, falling and landing, spelunking, how to deal with tight spaces, rubble, the effects of fatigue and exhaustion, the wide range of stuff. I mean, it's just great. Movements, effects of darkness, movement on slippery horizontal surfaces. Then we get into some additional proficiencies. So we're having construction time, success and failure for proficiencies, artisan, craftsman, other NPCs. This was just kind of like tacked into it. So character proficiencies governing the use of weapons have long been a part of AD&D game. Oriental Adventure rules introduced non-weapon proficiencies for artistic, practical, and social categories. In the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, the concept of proficiencies is expanded to include a number of common skills that can aid characters in underground exploration and survival. So, it just it adds yourself some more information, some more ways to fill in the blanks or to further fluff out your character or your adventure. But the fact was that, it's somebody's going to come up with this stuff. And they build upon this, and then we keep building on it. You really take this to the next level in second edition. And when I get to second edition, and you've been in second edition, you full well know what I'm talking about. There's a whole frickin' shelf full of specific books targeting specific character classes and races and settings, for example. And so they can take it to the crunch gets even crunchier. Now we've got a crunch that can sit in a bowl of milk and weather the day. So that's kind of how we got to that from that point, this point to that point. And it's from that point, once you have this plethora of rules where everything is possibly looked at, worked over, argued about, debated, thrown out, picked back up, put back together again, put forward, accepted, denied, the whole spiel. To get to the more rules light systems, a couple of things really had to happen. A, you had to have a whole slew of really thick, heavy-duty, crunchy game systems that would incite people to want to have go back to the basic simplicity of the earlier style. Because if you go back to the original Dungeons and Dragons books, you go back to the Red Basic, for example, the system's straightforward. It's very easy, it's very simple, and you don't have a whole lot of crunch to it. It's through evolution and a growing demand and crazy people like me who wanted to see it. And so because we have it, we now can winnow it down. We now can polish it up. We can edit it out. We can determine what really works well, what's really the most accepted, what people want to know and what people really need to know, and then condense them into smoother system rules that allow for rules lights to function better. And that's a hard part of it. That's a hard truth of the way a lot of that works. How do you know that the story-based system works so well if we didn't have the story-based system evolve from something that it wasn't? We weren't sitting around campfires telling fables and or passing down family lore. We were trying to create something from scratch using a whole lot of parameters that we're not all accustomed to. Not everybody is a freaking writer. Not everybody is an actor. Some people will never immerse themselves into a game system to so flawlessly that they can look like they're a professional voice actor or a professional person actually living in a holodrama of what they're participating in. The lion's share of players don't want to have don't spend the time, don't want to spend the time, don't have the desire to do that. And if you can get a handful of them together and you get that theater of the mind really rocking, it really comes off as something like a production. But you know what? It's not likely to be flawless and smoothless no matter how much you want to push some elements, and some people think it ought to be. All more the power for them to push for it. I mean, you encourage that thought and that process to become more immersed, to buy into the game, immerse yourselves into the campaign, into the characters, into the event, become the character. That's kind of the concept from the very beginning of what playing a role is, in my understanding of it anyway. And granted, my understanding is tainted by being old and having been in this business, in this hobby since freaking 10 years old. So that's 47 freaking years. You don't like it? Kick rocks. That's all I got to say on that topic. So, combat rules for underground play: fighting on walls and other sheer surfaces, fighting on bridges and ledges, grabbing an enemy, not as opposed to grappling. So when we talk about grabbing, you see those cliffhanger parts in a video or in a movie where two people are fighting on the edge of a cliff and one of them loses his balance or gets shoved by the other one, and the other one that's going to fall reaches out and grabs the other person and takes them with him, drags them down with him. That's what that's about. So, fighting in water, grappling in water, fighting in darkness, spellcasting in darkness, rules for mounted combat, forcing opponents to dismount, fighting in narrow passages, extremely narrow frontages, combat modifiers, formation modifiers. This would be the Battlesystem game options for underground combat. Back in that area, they had something called the AD&D Battlesystem. It was an attempt to resurrect the tabletop board game version, because Dungeons and Dragons evolved out of a board game. You know, the original stuff that Gygax and his buddies put together was for tabletop board gaming. So that's where the stuff evolved out of. And then at one point they tried to put that back in so you could have an actual set of rules for conducting your minis and larger formation operations. And eventually it gets melded into second and third edition, and it's now just part of the system. It's a given, right? So we talk about ventilation effects, morale effects, flying effects, line of sight effects, cave-ins on a battlefield, underground environment, air supply, things like duration, fire, smoke, poison and noxious gases, ventilation, odor detection, the cave-ins and the causes of them, additional accidental causes, causes by excavation, causes by sabotage, random occurrences in cave-ins. You see, they tried to cover as many different possible scenarios as they could, and it's what led to the crunch, those endless series of what people consider splat books. Well, define splat book, right? I've heard that term used a lot, and sometimes loosely and sometimes very succinctly, and yet it always bothers me because my definition of what's considered a splat book and what others consider a splat book are, I don't know, not the same. So for me, a book like this could be easily considered a splat book because it has nothing to do with mechanics of the game system or perpetrating the tabletop board game portion of it. It does give you some background and element issues and stuff for your role-playing game version of it, but what is more about it is it's the sandbox expander, or the time flow for the universe that you're acting in. Things go, things change, things progress, and time moves forward. And this is what keeps us up in that particular era of the game that we're in play in. So is it necessary? No. No, if you don't really care about any of that stuff, you don't really care about who's fighting who and why, you don't care about the current politics of the inner sphere, or how a fantasy kingdom's operating, who gives a shit, right? You don't need it. What's the point? So, it just is what it is. All right, so we got optional rules for hypothermia, magnetic effects of lodestones, NPC reactions. Keep in mind, once again, you see books like this and people go, oh, why would you want to know this? We could just Google that. No. It wasn't a Google then. And these things came out when the beginning of the foundation for this vast set of rules and material was working on the assumption the majority of people did not have access to a massive online database or multiple databases like we do today. This is a relatively new thing. Truthfully, it is. I mean, it gets bigger and more expansive and more user-friendly and more problematic every day. If you go back just 20 years, for you 20-somethings, none of this crap existed. Your mom and dad did not have all this crap. If you were like me in the 80s, we didn't have cell phones. Nobody owned cell phones except really rich individuals, bankers, and people living in New York Wall Street or something, because the damn things weighed 100 pounds. They had to be connected to a car, and the systems were hideously expensive and few and far in between. If you were the cool kid if you had a pager, right? Mercifully, my cousin had a pager. I always thought it was just a waste of money. And I was always big on spending my money on wasting it on game stuff. I mean, that was just me. And weed. Yes, I'm a big pothead for a long time. That also played an effect and a role in having some problems in my younger years that caused other problems. And it just is what it is. It's a matter of perspective, right? Not that I think it's a bad thing. Frankly, I honestly would rather see weed legal across the United States at all levels, and alcohol outlawed. You should make outlaw, bring back prohibition. I mean, that's just, alcohol is much more destructive in my personal opinion. But hey, and it's just as much of a gateway quote drug as any freaking pot ever made. That's just my personal opinion. And of course, every state around my state is getting that mindset on the books, and except my state, because my state's a bunch of I don't know, conservative yahoos who really don't think they know what they're doing half the time. Anyway, NPC reactions to long underground adventures. And I found this one pretty quick, because I read this here the other day and I thought, yeah. Unsteady NPC reaction. The character runs screaming toward the surface to the limits of his endurance. The character attacks a nearby PC. The character attempts to sneak away quietly as soon as possible. The character freezes in place, not reacting or moving. This is what happens after the longer you're underground, the deeper you go. It's one thing for the player character. It's another thing for the non-player characters. And to have some outlet that just arbitrarily says, oh, Joe over there just flipped out. Or Jean over there, she's no longer with you. Nobody knows her slip away in the middle of the night because they're terrified of being down here and they want to go home, And you have that little bit of option instead of your players going, you do that on purpose, we need them guys. Well, all right. Floating on water, rate of flow, water temperatures, damming the flow, access to underground waterways, underground water travel. I mean, so the wide range of crap is so much stuff. Mining, where to mine, types of mines, quality of mine, products, shoring up a tunnel. I actually ran a campaign where some players, they stumble across what was that? Platinum or gold? It was a mine. They were down in a series of tunnels, adventuring, and stumbled across what was left of an old mine. It was actually hadn't been played out. Next thing I know, they set themselves up in a mining operation. I'm like, okay, and that lasted for a couple months, right? Until they mined it out. The gold ran out. Quality mine, gemstones, things like this. So going in continuous on that now. What is that? Inherent hazards of mining, smelting ore, finishing stones, natural hazards, hiring loyalty, culture, or unnatural hazards. Yeah, you find yourself a gem mine, you're likely to find it contested. Then we come into to get new equipment. So one of those things that a lot of new players over the years I've noticed when they picked up the player's handbook and they look at the equipment guide, they're like, is that all there is? There's not a whole lot. That's one of those things that led to entire books devoted to equipment, magic items, and the same thing with I don't know, look at our BattleTech game, and all of them have scores of books on the gear and machinery because people want to buy they want stuff to buy. So one of the things we had to take into account was that you only have a limited amount of space, and when they create a overall core book, you don't want it to be dominated by one section of it, or try not to anyway. Sometimes that's harder to do than it sounds. So to have come back with arms and equipment guides, for example, is a natural thing. So we've seen that progress in these quote, setup source books. And so in this case, we're looking at equipment that's suitable for a dungeoneering, for operating in underground environments. Things. So we got air bladders, baskets, boxes, crowbars, a drill, grappling hooks, powdered chalk, pulleys, shovels, whistles, collapsible boats, kayaks. Equipment for proficiencies, and they get into a little more depth. Lard, common substance occasionally employed as lubricant to help large objects, including characters, squeeze through small holes. A character who has been smeared with lard can squeeze through the passageways that is only 80% as wide as the minimum passage needed, as explained under movement rules. Lard is also mildly flammable, but unlike oil, burns too stubbornly for it to function as a weapon. Smeared with lard, a character that sustains any damage from fire-based attack also suffers. Yeah, blah blah blah. It can also be used as an insulating coating for swimmers who enter very cold water. So, right, it's just how we have these extra little things that pop up. And we got how you can improve your play, expedition planning, scouting information, gathering type of expedition, using beast of burden. Here's mules and dogs, and using watercraft, creating diversions, fighting effectively, speeding up play. It's always a topic. How do we make this game go faster if we're spending most of our time flipping dice and digging through books looking for obscure rules? Right? That's one of those things that led to people cry about crunchy game systems. Well, we got to roll 42 dice just to get one result. That's kind of retarded. Languages in the Underdark, mapping techniques. All right, now we get into the Dungeon Master section. Features of the underground game, and I really found this quite valuable because when the book came out, I had already been creating game stuff for my friends for quite a few years at that point, and I started to branch out into buying fewer and fewer modules, except for the flair or the flavor. I have a lot of Forgotten Realms stuff, for example, mostly because it helps set up settings for that game world. But this one here started to open myself up to some visuals, because if we get into some of the artwork back here, where we start to get some ideas of just what we're trying to explain to our players, it's just so much more. I'm trying to find those specific ones. So we start really getting visuals and an understanding of just how 3D work would set and how this works. So when you're underground, it's not just like you're on a level field above. You're literally in the possibilities of a three-dimensional up-down environment where you can take into a lot more, have to count for a lot more things, or have a lot more options along that way for creating challenges and entertaining scenery for your players. Then we talk about other stuff, Swiss cheese, hollow earth, isolated pockets, sparse connection, blah, blah, blah. Then we cultures of the Underdark, and gives us a little bit of an overview. A lot of these already appeared in the monster manual. This just kind of steps up what's in there. Also brings them together in a nice little package. Then we talk about the lands of the deep earth, tunnels, passages, details. We're back to that, learning how to do three-dimensional maps and to learn to stack your maps. So your maps actually, your game is not just out here on the 2D flat surface, but it actually has depth. So if they go down a tunnel, now you got to bring up a different map because now they've changed locations. Talk about different types of caverns, Great Lake, surface lands, upper caverns, cathedral caverns, caverns of the ancients, enclosed, Grand Canyon of the Deepearth, a fungus forest. When I read through this, I kept thinking of a bunch of different novels I've read from, the Drizzt Do'Urden's saga, and a lot of the visuals that were presented to the reader echoes the knowledge this book kind of had. This book foreshadowed, or he had access and utilized elements of it. It's common knowledge stuff, right? So I mean, the sheer level, Domain of the Druger, the Windpipe, Hollowed Grounds, the Melting Pot, Lands of the Deep Gnomes, Lower Grand Canyon, Elemental Vortex of Fire. I mean, Jesus, a whole bunch of stuff. Campaign considerations, problem solvers, role players. So many of us fit in this category at some point in our gaming career. Role players really enjoy creating every detail of their characters' lives down to ancestry and minor possessions. Role players are not satisfied with being told their party has acquired some necessary equipment for an expedition at the general store. Instead, these players want to role play those whole shopping experiences and enjoy haggling over copper pieces with a poor shopkeeper and his DM stand-in. Role players view the adventures as opportunities for their player characters to grow. These characters may be developed to a level of almost painful detail. Role players almost always include one or more faults among their player character characteristics, since this aids the character's believability. Right? Fine art of juggling your campaign and your characters and the players' needs and all this stuff. It's hard to be a good dungeon master. It's a never-ending attempt to improve and get better. At the same time, dungeon masters get tired. Dungeon masters have brain freeze occasionally. Writer's block occurs. Sometimes they get tired and they get bored of being the observer in a lot of things, and they want to participate. And there are so many challenges to being even an average game master that entire videos are created on a regular basis by many good people out there with very more succinct abilities to explain it and to help you to understand what you are missing or you think you're missing or whatever. Plot and counterplot, the importance of story structure. Yeah, I don't know of very many dungeon masters. If you started out as a kid, you spend so much of your life creating these stories and these scenarios and events and campaigns for your friends and quote yourself to enjoy, you start to develop this I want to write something mindset, and you start running to become more elaborate. You want to get more detail, and sometimes that can be counterproductive. I've run into this myself on numerous occasions. It is a character flaw on my part. It's hard for me not to want a campaign setting to be even more in-depth than the player wants it to be. They don't want to mess with a bunch of excess fluff, and in my opinion that's what sets it apart and what makes it so special. That was my problem when I was trying to run a couple campaigns in the D&D Beyond setup. The play-by-post because I could never get people together at the same time I was available, and it's hard for me to run an in-person game system anymore, in part because my job is very erratic. The hours are all over the place, and then I have my wife's at home by herself all the time, so I mean she graces me with the time I have to do the videos every week. I mean, sometimes it can be an argument, and sometimes it's, you're going to do videos tomorrow, right? Yeah, I'm going to do this my way, I'm going to do this and this, and I'm like, oh, right? But it's another thing to sit down for 4 or 5 hours and do a Skype game or something. It's just, I don't have that luxury right now. It just is what it is. So, this tends to lead us to want to write and write things because we still want to see where the story goes. We still want to see where the characters, some of these characters develop are so rich and so interesting that you almost scream out to go into more detail and things like that. So what I'm getting at is, it was through these books in my young youth days and my developing of trying to come up with creative things and stories for our table that led me to develop a true wish to write. And I don't do nearly as much of it as I used to. We're back to that time constraint thing. I also run into horrible, you know, procrastination issues on times, in part because usually I'm tired. Yesterday, not that you care, I worked out 3 hours in the morning, and then the wife and I ran all our errands, went to the bank, spent every penny we had, and tapped a credit card we shouldn't have, and then to finish getting what we needed to get. And then in the evening, I went back out and I did another 5-hour job and got home a little before midnight last night. And that's a typical day for me. It's hard to do things, to find time to just sit down and just not, to focus on a lot of heavy stuff. It is what it is. So one of the things I thought I'd do with this buy me a cup of coffee thing that I'm experimenting with, and actually somebody donated $25 to me, and I'm utterly astonished and grateful. I intend to use that to buy a BattleTech PDF, because as soon as I figure out how to tap the money on it, but is another venue for me producing some of my written work as supplements, as I don't know, as some kind of stuff on it. And so if you want to go and just look at that crap, you don't have to give me no money. It's like my grandfather. My grandfather was a minister for 50 damn years. Had a small church on the south side of Des Moines. He never passed the plate. He put the plate by the back door. As you come in by the front door, as you came in, it was there on the first pew next to you, and you knew it was there. You either put money in it or you didn't. That was Grandpa's way. He was going to trust that you would help out or you wouldn't help out. You do what you. Nobody should be feeling obligated to do anything. That's why it's great to support people's channels. It's great for memberships. It's great for these Patreons and crap like that. And I'm not knocking any of that stuff. It's just that sometimes they ram that theme pretty hard because they're doing it for a living. They're trying to generate money. I'm just trying to get by and do what I can do to keep everything going. Multiple storylines, stuff like this, story elements, excellent stuff. This was I read this section quite a few times and went back for inspiration on it a number of times as well. And of course, a section on mapping your settings and stuff. And that's always been a wonderful part of the gaming stuff for me, was map creation and things like that. So there's actually the folks that wrote this, Douglas Now, created a much more modern version that's not a Dungeons & Dragons product. And I did a short video a year and a half ago on that video, or on that book. And I will probably, if I think about it, next week I will get that book off the shelf and we'll do another drive-by with it and compare them. So he updated and modernized the Dungeoneer survival guide for the modern environment, and it can be used in any sword and sorcery, just about any game system, to be truth. There's so much element of issues or material in here that if you get away from the dice mechanics of how something works, just the explanations of how things work, these sort of books cross genre divides. If my mech warriors somehow found themselves in a underground environment without their mechs, many of the rule set in here would be applicable in BattleTech, or in Star Wars, or at least that's just my opinion, guys. Anyway, I'm Rick and you're not. Until next time, you guys, here's the spiel. Going on, my friends, this is Rick, and hey, if you like the channel, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, tell your buddies, tell your friends, tell your coworkers, tell anybody else that's in the gaming industry or gaming fandom that says, hey, this is a channel worth checking out, right? Till next time, I hope you guys